we're looking at a mystery defined entirely by a single missing frame of security footage. It's the kind of case that forces us to ask how someone can just vanish in the modern world. Today, we're going to break down the timeline, the evidence, and the physical environment to try and understand the unresolved disappearance of Brian Shaffer. April 1st, 2006, 1:55 a.m., Columbus, Ohio. This is the last known visual trace. Security cameras capture 27-year-old medical student Brian Shaffer right outside a crowded bar. You can see he speaks to two women. The night is winding down. He turns. He moves back toward the entrance, and then he vanishes from confirmed view. That is the core, chilling facts of this explainer. Where did Brian go after 1:55 a.m.? Investigators pored over these recordings. They could clearly see him at the bar. They watched crowds of people leaving as the night ended. But Brian's definitive departure? It's simply missing. There is no confirmed sighting, no established destination, no definitive explanation for how a man goes out for drinks and disappears somewhere between a crowded bar and the sunrise. But to really grasp how difficult this disappearance is to explain, we actually need to rewind. We have to go back a few hours, reconstruct the evening progressively, and understand Brian's life right before that camera ultimately lost him. Beneath the surface of what looks like a typical spring break night out, the reality of Brian's life was actually pretty complex. He was a 27-year-old medical student at Ohio State University, studying under immense pressure. He had a trip coming up with his girlfriend, which he was looking forward to, but most importantly, underneath all these ordinary plans, he was enduring a profound personal strain. He was heavily grieving the recent loss of his mother to cancer. Let's track his night. On the evening of March 31st, Brian went out with a friend for a few drinks. It was a simple plan, mostly just to escape the heavy pressure of exams. As they moved through the Columbus nightlife, they were joined by another friend. Eventually, this group makes their way back to a bar near the Ohio State campus called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. It was noisy, busy, and full of movement, exactly the kind of place where you could step away for a minute without causing any immediate alarm. Which brings us right back to that critical timestamp, 1:55 a.m. Brian is seen near the entrance, speaking briefly with those two women. Then, he simply moves out of the camera's view. This right here is the exact pivot point, the moment an ordinary night out transforms into an enduring mystery. Now put yourself in his friend's shoes. Context in these early hours is everything. As the bar was closing up, his friends were ready to head out, but they couldn't locate him. They tried calling his phone, no answer. So they made an assumption that made total sense at the time. They figured he had already left. Maybe he walked home, maybe he met someone, or maybe they just got separated in the crowd. In the early morning hours after drinking, none of those possibilities seemed extraordinary. But then, daylight broke, April 1st, 2006, and Brian did not reappear. His phone calls went unanswered, his planned trip and all his other obligations just passed without him. Slowly, all of those harmless, logical explanations completely collapsed. Brian hadn't simply left his friends for the night. He was gone. When investigators realized he was truly missing, their first instinct was to turn to the footage. And remember, we're not talking about an isolated forest or an empty highway here. This was a busy nightlife complex. It was heavily surrounded by people, witnesses, and cameras. And this is where the terrifying contrast really sets in. Investigators had a verified, confirmed presence of Brian at that bar shortly before 2 a.m. But they had absolutely no confirmed exit. The most important moment, the exact step where he went from being there to being gone, was nowhere on the available footage. Now, I need to clear up a major misconception here. You will often hear this called an impossible locked room mystery. It isn't. The building included an area associated with construction, which offered possible, unmonitored routes of movement. The footage doesn't prove Brian vanished into thin air inside the bar. Rather, investigators could not identify him leaving on the available surveillance footage. He could have left unseen. So, the frustrating aftermath begins. Police and loved ones launched massive searches of the area. They combed the surroundings, checked local hospitals, and interviewed everyone connected to that night, from the two women he spoke with to the bar staff. And the result? 0 breakthroughs. Not a single confirmed trail leading away from the building. When days bleed into weeks, a case inevitably produces theories. We have to look at these neutrally, keeping in mind that suspicion is not evidence. First, there's voluntary disappearance. Given his recent grief and sheer exhaustion, could he have just walked away from his life? Second, an accident. a fall or some kind of incident via one of those unmonitored construction routes. Or third, foul play, an encounter with a stranger or an argument that escalated after he left. Now, darker theories have definitely spread online over the years, but absolutely none of them have publicly resolved this case. What followed in these subsequent months and years were, quite frankly, devastating moments of false hope. When an investigation has no definitive answers, any small anomaly feels like a massive breakthrough, only to ultimately lead nowhere. There were specific leads that kept his family holding their breath, hoping he might still be alive. Reports emerged that Brian's phone actually rang months after he vanished. There were alleged, unconfirmed sightings called in. Authorities even went as far as releasing an age-progressed image in 2021, but despite all of it, nothing produced a confirmed answer. Fast forward to today, we're looking at nearly 20 years passing. Brian Shaffer is no longer the 27-year-old man frozen in that grainy early digital CCTV footage. If he's alive, he'd be in his late 40s. The Ugly Tuna Saloona itself is no longer the bustling center of Columbus nightlife it once was. The people who knew him have grown older. And the cameras? They recorded exactly what they recorded and nothing more. Which means we have to circle right back to the beginning, to that same emotional dread of the last known moment. Maybe Brian found an exit the cameras didn't cover. Maybe something happened right after he reached the street. Or maybe the answer is buried in a detail investigators saw but just didn't quite understand. After all the extensive searches, the interviews, and decades of speculation, the last verified chapter of Brian Shaffer's life still ends at exactly 1:55 in the morning. He was there, and then he wasn't. The real question isn't just where he is now, it's what happened in those very minutes after the camera lost sight of him. He was surrounded by people, by friends, by security cameras, and yet none of it produced the next frame. The available record gives us a final known image, but the next chapter simply does not exist. The case remains unsolved.